All right, let's get into it. When we talk about the people who built modern India, we often picture fiery revolutionaries. But today, we're looking at someone totally different, a man who was incredibly complex, full of contradictions, and who really shaped India from the inside out. His story? It's a masterclass in the clash between what we believe and what we can actually do. He wore a lot of hats.
For starters, he was the ultimate insider, a high-ranking judge working within the British colonial government. He was also a brilliant scholar, part of the very first graduating class of Bombay University. And at the same time, he was a radical social reformer, pushing back against the very traditions he was born into.
Plus, he was a hugely influential author, writing about economics and history in a way that would inspire a whole generation. So the big question is, how on earth did one person manage to be all of these things at once?
So let's properly introduce him. Mahadev Govind Ranade, born way back in 1842, was a co-founder of the Indian National Congress and really one of the key architects of modern Indian thinking. But his entire life was this incredible balancing act. He was working inside the system he wanted to change, and he was pushing for reforms that, as we'll see, he himself had a really hard time living up to. And it all started with his brain. I mean, the man was a phenomenal student. Just look at this timeline. He wasn't just in the first ever graduating class of the University of Bombay. He absolutely crushed it, getting a BA, an MA, and a law degree in just 4 years. This put him right at the top of this new, English-educated Indian elite. And of course, that kind of education opened a lot of doors. Ranade went on to have a really successful career inside the British administration, eventually becoming a judge of the Bombay High Court. But it was his whole approach to politics that was so different. This is how people described him. You see, unlike a lot of other nationalists, Ranade wasn't trying to kick the British out. No, he was a believer in slow, steady, gradual reform. He actually saw British rule not just as a colonial force, but as a modernizing one. And he figured the smartest way forward was to work with them, to slowly but surely transform India from within. Okay, but here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while Ranade the politician was patient, Ranade the social reformer was not. The same guy who worked so carefully within the system looked at the society around him and saw a desperate need for some seriously radical change. And he wasn't vague about it. He took aim at very specific things. He went after child marriage, the purdah system that kept women hidden away, the awful practice of shaving the heads of widows, even things like insane wedding costs and caste rules that stopped people from traveling abroad. To him, these weren't just old customs. They were deep moral problems that were holding all of India back. And right at the center of all this were two ideas that were totally connected: letting widows get married again and making sure girls and women got an education. For Ranade, this wasn't just another issue on a list. The freedom of women was the absolute bedrock of a modern and just society. This phrase pretty much sums up his entire worldview. Ranade looked at the India of his day, with all its strict rules and traditions, and felt it was missing these 3 key things. His life's work was basically trying to inject humanity, equality, and a deeper sense of spirituality back into society. But, it's one thing to preach radical ideas. It's a whole other thing to live them. And that brings us to the most difficult and, frankly, the most human part of Ranade's story. This is where the public champion of reform comes face to face with a deep personal crisis. A moment where his ideals slam right into the wall of family pressure and tradition. So let's set the scene. Just remember, the cause of widow remarriage was absolutely central to who he was. As a teenager, way before he was a famous judge, he had co-founded an entire organization just to promote it. This was his signature issue, his life's cause. And then, tragedy hit. Ranade's first wife passed away, leaving him a widower in his 30s. All his reformer friends were watching, expecting him to finally lead by example and marry a widow. But his family had other ideas. They demanded that he marry a young girl from what they considered a proper family. He was completely trapped. He was terrified that if he defied them and married a widow, any children they might have would be shunned by society. The pressure was unbelievable. And in the end, he gave in. The great champion of widow remarriage married an 11-year-old girl named Ramabai. And here is the gut-wrenching irony of it all. The very reason he compromised his deepest principles, this desperate desire for children who would be accepted by society, it never happened. His second marriage was also childless.
It's just such a powerful, painful reminder of the huge personal cost and the impossible compromises that even the most dedicated reformers sometimes have to face. So, with a contradiction like that at the center of his life, how do we even begin to look at his legacy? Well, after he died in 1901, it became really clear that the things he built, the institutions and the ideas, were way more powerful than any one personal failure. See, the key to understanding Rana Day is that he wasn't just a thinker. He was a builder, a serious institution builder. We're talking about everything from giant political organizations like the Indian National Congress to social reform groups to educational societies. He created the actual machinery that would keep the work of reform moving forward long after he was gone.
But maybe the most powerful and the most personal part of his legacy was his wife. Yeah, despite the really difficult start to their marriage, Ranade poured his energy into educating Ramabai. He didn't just teach her, he empowered her, turning her from a child bride into his intellectual partner. And after he died, she became a force of nature, a pioneering reformer in her own right, carrying on the very work he had started.
And of course, we can't forget his books and his essays. His writings on economics and his histories of the Maratha Empire gave a whole new generation of Indian thinkers and leaders the intellectual tools they needed. His influence really was everywhere.
So, we end up right back where we started, with a man of deep contradictions. Ranade was a visionary who imagined a more humane, more equal India. But he was also a man of his time who couldn't quite escape the pull of the very traditions he was fighting. His story doesn't give us any easy answers. Instead, it leaves us with a really important question. How should we remember the pioneers who show us a better path, even if they stumble on it themselves?